All right, here we are, middle of December. We've had our second 1 inch snow. I guess the other one was maybe a little bit bigger. Typical for us up here in New Hampshire to not have a serious snow till after Christmas or around Christmas. Usually something before Christmas, I should say. And then the cold weather comes in January. Uh, but I've been heating my studio with a wood stove now for a very fair number of weeks. Yeah. Well, let's see. Where were we? I'm tempted to start this thing off telling you a joke I heard this past week, but are you cringing, Mr. Producer? It's, I, I guess I have to tell you now that I started, but I heard that there were two nuts walking down the road, and one of them was assaulted, and that's that's the extent of my capacity with jokes. It's actually a pun. If you're from a different country, you might not get, if your English isn't. Oh well. I, Mr. Producer, I couldn't help myself, so you can put a note up there if you want to say something bad about me. I really have always enjoyed puns. I could tell you three or four more, but I won't. Mr. Producer heard it at the same time I did. He probably thought he's going to remember that and try to use it on his show. I bet he did think that. Well, we've got Andrews C. Cruz on the line here, so to speak. Not on the line, not like last week, but he wants to talk about the textures and the use of texture in the surface of a canvas. So I'm going to read the entire thing, and this time I'm going to read it all the way through, and then I'm going to go back and read one sentence at a time, and we'll break it down. But it's a good question. I know we haven't addressed it of itself. We've mentioned it, but I'm sure in just passing. So this one is dedicated to you, texture. So here's Andre. I have a question about visual order and textures with oil paint. When I say textures, I mean impasto, more thin, and so on. I saw a Boston School painting at the Met, and the paint was so similarly applied it says on the all canvas. I think you mean to say on the whole canvas, and rather thin, that it surprised me in a negative way. I've seen many Vermeers in which the influence on that specific paint was obvious. Paxton, I think. But Vermeer treated the surface differently, depending on the area he wanted us to look, with more impasto, contrast. And when we talk about visual order, we humans tend to give more importance to specific areas, movements, and in a way we don't see what's around. Don't you think that treating the whole painting in the same way, and let's say give a naturalistic look to the whole canvas, giving same light, same contrast, same brushwork, misses the point on the truth about visual order? Because I think we humans tend to give attention to things hierarchical when we look at something, let's say an image, and even in everyday life, of course. To transfer a message, we have to be clear about it. I heard you say here that Tolstoy said, if your public doesn't understand you, it's not their fault. And I think Vermeer has a more clear message in the way it's that point on treating the message different depending on the areas he wants us to look at. So, Andre, I could have, and you guys might want to tell me in a message to me, I could have corrected, some of your prepositions. And I think I did correct a few prepositions, but I don't want to overdo the correcting of your comments to me. If it probably would be thoughtful in a way for me to do it, but I always feel a little bit presumptuous, so I haven't done it much. Yet I think I did a little bit in this one, so that it's easier to understand in just a couple of points. Mostly was having to do with prepositions. That is, places like in which or on, the word on that specific paint. And in that one, okay, but let's just go. But I want you to have thought about that. If anybody wants to comment to me, I don't know if there's a standard out there. You know how it is here, though. This is impromptu rather and off the cuff, and I sort of take it as it lays. And that would be true, of course, if I ever have you on. I'm not going to be able to sit there and correct your way of saying it. I might ask you, could you say that differently? Which would be an advantage of having somebody there. But in the meantime, just a thought for anybody who has an inclination to comment, who might feel like they know something or feel something about what it does when I don't make a correction for those who are not American speakers, shall I say. I would say English speakers, but even that could be different. All right, so I have a question about visual order and textures with oil paint. So let's, just starting with that, visual order and textures. Textures, the way I use that word, has to do with the illusion of texture. That is to say, if you're looking across a canvas, across the room, and the wall is smooth and flat, but the rug has a texture on it. That's the way I use the word texture. It's a different thing when I talk about the surface of the canvas, but this is about the surface of the canvas. So when I say, and by the way, visual order for me isn't, and I'll get into that in a minute, but just understand I'm going to come to that. But the visual order is not story order. So that's a very important thing for you to understand, Andre, if you're misconceiving that. I remember I'm talking as a quote unquote Boston School type impressionist, not as a storytelling painter. And I know you might say that, well, of course, Vermeer is also an impressionist, as it were, or Velázquez and that sort of thing. And by the way, I would recommend you look at Velázquez to see how his textures look, his, what you're calling texture, the thicker, thinner paint, the more impasto portions somewhere and less impasto somewhere else. But I'm going to give you all the reasons for what we do in this training that I've had, okay? And you can imagine that there's a reason for everything we do. But you can also make the argument for other reasons that we don't make part of our propositions, shall we say. So now he says, I saw a Boston School painting at the Met. The paint was so similarly applied on all the canvas, so that's all the way across the canvas, and rather thin that it surprised me in a negative way. But I got to say something about that. I remember when I first saw, and I'd already learned the concept of thin in the start, or when you're painting, the amount of paint you're using is thick over thin. Fat over lean, and those things are slightly different, but they produce somewhat similar results. So thinness was a thing, of a sort. And I'd already run into the idea that if you paint too thinly, you can't get color quality. So you want to be thoughtful about that. But why thin paint? So now you're talking about our guy. You're talking about Paxson, and Paxson was the guy, I'm sure, I would guess at least, that was giving attention to Gamel, my mentor, to Gamel and the way he applied paint, the amount of paint he was applying. So, but that's a very, very straightforward thing. But what I want to tell you is that I went to Hispanic Society and saw that a beautiful head by, really magnificent and efficient and well expressed head of the Cardinal by Velázquez. If you haven't seen it, it's really worth your time, especially as you know the Boston School a little bit more and you understand that there was a connection that the Boston School wanted us to make. There's the Boston School educators, the guys who would have been the titular heads of the Boston School, with regard, wanted us to make with Velázquez. So I'm going to break in just for a second. I'm sitting here looking at a camera, and it was so delightful last week to look at Michael, even though he was on the screen, and to be able to talk to a human. And I felt my whole potential for expressing myself richly and in other, in various ways, more fully, had to do with seeing his face. So I just want to comment about that. I do want to use some more of you guys. So at some point, I don't know if you all want to suggest one of yourselves, and I think one of you already mentioned possibly wanting to do something with me, but I'm definitely going to do this again. It's just I find myself staring at the camera here, feeling a little discombobulated because I'm not seeing any expression on the face of the camera or any of you on the other side of this thing. So that was my little lyric interlude. So let's read the next one. I have seen many Vermeers in which the influence on that specific paint was obvious. On that particular painting, with the influence on that particular painting was obvious. Yeah, Paxton's paintings are obviously Vermeer influenced. But Vermeer treated the surface differently depending on the area he wanted us to look. Let me just talk about that point, in the area he wanted us to look. How do you know that's the area he wanted you to look? And how do you know the impasto was there for that reason? You've got to be thoughtful about what, when you draw those conclusions, is that really the reason? Or, for example, one of the things that happens when if you save your lights till later on is you wind up being forced to paint with more impasto. And so is that really a choice that has to do with where you want somebody to spend more time, shall we say? Or where you want people to look? Because I'll tell you how we do it is different. So let me, so he says, or with more impasto. Now, contrast, I would agree, with more impasto, contrast. Now, if you said contrast of the impasto, is it making it more impasto in certain places as part of the package of those areas that have higher contrast? I could just say it's not an implausible thing, by the way. And by the way, in the whole question of texture on a canvas, I leave that to the painter. But I'm going to give you the reasons for what we do as impressionists. And this reminds me of a point at which I was working with Gamel, and had been working with thick paint and stuff. Brackman, you'd build up paint pretty good with the Brackman process frequently. And certainly they would get to this point of having thick colors on thick colors, a little bit Monet-like in those areas. I mean, just in terms of the amount of clumped on paint, not that it looked bad, I didn't mean it that way. And there was but I ran into quickly when I was working that way, as soon as I wanted to paint this big, smooth wall behind it, I suddenly realized that, or in fact, even when painting the nude, this broken color and textured paint would give texture to the skin, and the skin wouldn't flow smoothly, wouldn't look beautiful in the way we were doing it, by the way. Now, it doesn't mean somebody painting with thicker paint can't make the skin flow smoothly and look like a smooth surface of the wall. But that was one of those things that came up. I was thinning the paint to make a smooth wall, and then I was making it thicker in parts of the figure. And it had a disunity about it, an unpleasant disunity. So if you wind up doing stuff that shows, and this is a visual disunity, right? So you're talking about the surface of the canvas, how aesthetically pleasing it is. And if it's just disconcertingly built up over in one place and there's no logic to how it feels when you look at the whole field in terms of texture, then you might consider that there's a disunity texturally on the canvas itself. So, but to see that Velázquez, the smoothness of the surface was the thing that impressed me. It wasn't ridge-free entirely, but it was so smooth. And that's, by the way, my recollection is now well over 20 years ago. But that was what so stunned me. And I said, oh, Velázquez did that, what we were being told to do. And he didn't seem to have any problem with that. Remember, all of us as students are out there in this world that's got way too many possibilities. That's why I say you're looking for best practices because you aren't going to be doing everything all the time in any case, right? So, but for certain things, certain efficiencies apply. And that's where thin paint and not making ridges at the start in your painting are really important, because you want to be able to move the dark over the light and not have a ridge left behind down there when you draw with the dark. And the next day, when you suddenly realize your hand might have to move over a little bit, you don't want to draw there and then have this big ridge you're going to now scrape down. By the way, Sargent's scraping, they talk about him scraping down the head. Was that because he was getting ridges, or was he just getting off the paint that wasn't quite wet and just for the purposes of laying it back in again and getting down to a relatively smooth surface? So my guess is that both are true, but it also might mean that he was painting fairly ridgy. But still, you should look at his work, just see. And what you'll see with most people's work is that there's going to be a certain amount of ridges that just simply live in the painting. And there's an expectation that there's going to be a uniformity of surface aesthetically. That what you handle in one area, you're going to handle similarly in other areas, or at least you're going to have sets of those things so that they form their own groups. You'll just have to think that through for yourself. But But contrast is a way big thing. So we're always definitely trying to get you to look in a certain place by contrast, or by just by definition, the place your eye is going to look is the place with the highest contrast. And that's the thing that you begin to realize you have to deal with, right? That so are we so then, all right, so let's see if I can remember this now. At one point I was using texture to try to get the light effects stronger, right? To try to make the lights pop more. And I was thinking, how do you do that? You build up ridges and you build up clumpy paint. Well, I found out with like a clumpy highlight, you're at risk of getting a cast shadow literally on the highlight in certain lights. So that struck me as being a pretty not so good idea. But then the second part of it was I thought to myself, you're not doing this. That's tricky. If you're not doing this, you're not doing this with the note on the surface. So as a student, I knew that I wasn't relying on the relationships of the notes being right. I was relying on some other kinds of devices. And by the way, I get as much delight out of painterly painting. I'm going to say thick and juicy paint as much as anybody. I don't happen to do it that much. I find that what the general impression does is a color-based thing, and the drawing and all that sort of stuff relates to it. And I don't have any inclination, even at all, to go into textural activity. But still, again, I would never take it away from somebody else. And then he says, and when we talk about the visual order, we humans tend to give more importance to specific areas, movements, and in a way we don't see what's around. Now, if you're talking like a storyteller, you can find different ways of making noise. If you want me to look in a certain area, you'll find that the areas that have the most busyness and shape, the most shapiness, the highest contrast, the most color, those are areas that are going to draw your eye no matter what. Now, this, in my view, it's the view of the job of the painter to do that with those means that are standard. In other words, they're basically there: contrast, shapiness, whatever. And if you somehow wanted to add brushwork, thickening and impasto and stuff to that, just all I can say is keep looking at the unity of your whole surface when you do it, and make sure it makes sense visually to the what shall we call it, the textural aesthetic, because there is such a thing, right? By the way, another thing that we were told, this is now Gamma would be pointing and had been pointed to the Dutch and these really glassy surfaces they would paint, just really smooth, and Gamma would commend them to us. The fact of their flatness, the surface flatness. And when you consider that, when we were considering making the color relations, all that, and the shape and the drawing, also do our work, it was definitely a thing to say, let's aim at that. That's one of our standards, is to make a smooth, beautiful, smooth surface. So it was a high watermark of good painting, right? So to speak. In fact, we would, at the end of a painting day, we would be required to go and look at the side of the canvas and just peek at it and knock off any ridges of paint all through the whole canvas and bring it into a unity, into a smoothness of surface. Now, that's just a bit of background in terms of how we thought about it. And this is with the background of the Boston School guys. By the way, I'm going to then suggest to you that you look at Benson rather than Paxton if you want to see some texture. In fact, both Benson and Tarbell talking to each other once, I think, having seen a show of Soroya's work in New York, they both looked at each other, as it were, and concluded that they wouldn't be painting thinly again. But I don't know how much that meant in terms of, because I haven't found things that are brutally scumbly. I think if you look at in Boston at the one's called Reverie, you'll see probably as much texture as you'll ever see in a Tarbell. And there's a still life or two there in which all the paint is put on really fat. So it has considerably more of that, of what you're talking about, a textural surface, but it's not aimed at, as far as I can recall, it's not aimed at isolated spots. And it was certainly not something that was being taught. So I think that was a standard. It may have even been a standard that was taught in the academic world, the Prix-de-Rome type background. And I know, take a person like Lefebvre, I don't think their work would have worked particularly well, or Bouguereau, if they had created Impasto, I think it would have changed the entire aesthetic. But still, this is you do as you're inclined, but just be aware of that idea of the aesthetic of the texture. Just look at the whole, and if it's beautiful as a whole, then it isn't another issue. I'm still going to have to look at Vermeer next time I look at a Vermeer in person and take note of, see if I can see if that's something. It never was something that we made note of or were asked to look at. So you understand, I'm not your guy that way. So don't you think that treating the whole painting in the same way, and let's say give a naturalist look to the whole canvas, giving the same light, same contrast, same brushwork, misses the point on the truth about visual order? Yeah, so it doesn't. You're going back to storytelling. If you do a lot of stirring around and doing other stuff in a certain spot, people are definitely going to look at it more. And if that's your way of getting them over there, well, in one sense, it isn't any different from ours, as I already pointed out. We do it, we have the eye movement. The center of interest is this place for this, at least there will be a dominating place. Your eye will go there. And then your eye will, then it will be inclined to go to another place and other places in a sort of an order of effect if you think like we do. And I think the human eye does that. I found my eyes doing that, and which is why I accepted it. I mean, when I'm looking at paintings. And but no, in fact, it was considered that what you're just saying, given the same light, same contrast, same brush, blah, 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 it misses the point. It doesn't miss the point. The point of visual order isn't actually about, texture doesn't have anything to do with it per se. It has everything to do with contrast and those kinds of guys that are purely, shall we say, two-dimensional rather than sculptural. But I think we humans tend to give attention to things hierarchical when we look at something, let's say an image, and even in today's life, of course, to transfer a message, we have to be clear about it. Now, this is a really interesting question. So the question is, if you create a center of interest, but you want me to look over here, how do you do that? Because I'm not, especially from across the room, I'm not going to see your texture, so I'm not going to go over there. So in theory, you could then say, well, but if I have an area that has low contrast, then make it textural and really somehow or other do some kind of that kind of meaty work over there. Yeah, it'll have a uniqueness. It'll draw the eye over there once you get close to the picture. But if you think like we do in the Boston School, if you're that close, you're too close to the painting. If you're doing a 4-foot painting, your distance back from it should be roughly the same as it would be for making the painting, which is something like 3 times the greatest dimension. So you'd be back something like 12 or 15 feet to look at it properly. That would be the right place to size it. It's part of the reason when you look at a sargent, when you walk up to it, it breaks up. When you stay back, it's that you're seeing it now in situ. In other words, the way the painter was, the relationship the painter had to it when he was painting it, where everything was right, where everything was visually right? So I'm not inclined to think that that's a good idea to create texture somewhere where you really want the painter, where you really want us to go is where you do contrast. It's done with contrast. So as again, I would say you really don't have a need to not do it. As I said, I like paintings of all kinds. Texture is not something I despise in the way you're referring to it. So, and then so if somehow what you do doesn't make the painter understand it, the viewer will understand it if you follow the true visual order, which is the order of contrast and the order of light to your eye. You know, that projective punch. Your eye will travel through those things before it travels with texture. Okay, and I do mean texture of the paint thickness, sculptural, impasto, and So I think Vermeer has a more clear message, and the why it's that point on treating the painting different depending on the area he wants us to look at. So in your last point, it is true that if you ultimately do paint an area different from the rest, we're going to look at it. But that's one of those things that if you do it, say, in one spot, it's going to create disharmony in the painting. In other words, when you see, for example, when you see Degas do something curious thing, you'll see him do it again in another place. If you use as a red, you'll see him do variations on that red, and you'll see there's an aesthetic to the deportment of those things. But unity in painting requires a certain amount of, if you do texture, to do textures, to do play of texture, not just a texture, because that would be to commit yourself to storytelling, pure and simple, more than anything else. And by the way, it won't help you at all when your painting gets reproduced. So even as a storyteller, the reproduced painting, if you're doing it for a book or something like that, isn't going to show that. So now you've done something that doesn't produce too much good for you. But yeah, look around at a lot with that question, though. This is where I used to have an idea like that, and I'd go to the museum and just look at lots of paintings. So it's an interesting point, but just look more, spend more time, put more time into it. I hope I've made myself clear, Andre. But as I said, keep it up. If you see somebody else doing that, if you can somehow or other take a photograph of it that shows the textures, with some side light on it or something like that, that we could then discuss more fully, I'd be pleased to do that. All right, but I think that covers most of what I would say on this subject. I hope I've been a little bit clear. But this is absolutely the first of this time where I've tried to sort of, shall we say, to carry on for a while and make it as clear as I can possibly do. So, all right. I hope that sound is okay, Mr. Producer. I see that the bars aren't up where they had been. Huh. I bet my battery's running out. All right. So, guys, I think I'll have you one more before Christmas. Must be that, right? I think so. So I'll try to do something that has maybe a little bit more relation to Christmas in the next one. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week and enjoy your struggles, enjoy the studies, enjoy the research, enjoy just looking at pictures and never mind painting them. All right. Take care. Next time.